Hello, my sleepyheads. Tonight we'll travel to the eastern edge of Europe, to a city of golden domes, marble streets, and 1,000-year dream, Constantinople. This is the story of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman legacy that rose, burned bright, and slowly faded into shadow. But before we begin, thank you for being here. If these calm stories help you rest or bring you peace, it would mean the world if you liked the video and subscribed. Your support helps me keep making these quiet journeys through time, just for you. Now, let us begin. In the year 330, when the world was still young and empires were carved from stone and ambition, there stood a man upon the shores of the Bosporus. Emperor Constantine gazed across the narrow waters that separated Europe from Asia, where the ancient city of Byzantium had rested for 1,000 years. The wind carried the salt scent of two seas, the Black Sea to the north and the Sea of Marmara to the south. And in that moment, Constantine saw not what was, but what could be. The old Rome was distant now, its 7 hills heavy with the weight of centuries and the burden of an empire grown too vast to govern from a single heart. Here, where the Golden Horn curved like a crescent moon into the European shore, Constantine would build something new, something that would bridge the ancient world and the one yet to come. The city would bear his name, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The workers came in endless streams, their hammers ringing against marble and limestone as the sun traced its lazy arc across azure skies. They built not just with stone and mortar, but with dreams borrowed from Rome's greatest days. The Hippodrome rose first, its massive spine capable of holding 100,000 souls, while nearby the foundations of a great palace were laid, halls that would one day echo with the whispers of emperors and the rustle of silk robes. As Constantine's city took shape, something profound was happening to the empire itself. Like a great tree splitting at its trunk, the Roman world was dividing. The western lands, with their familiar Latin tongue and ancestral traditions, would continue under one emperor, while the east, Greek in culture, rich in trade, and closer to the mystical lands of Asia, would follow another path entirely. In 395, when Emperor Theodosius breathed his last, this division became permanent. To his son Honorius went the western lands, Italy, Gaul, Spain, and Britain, while the eastern territories, from the Balkans to the borders of Persia, passed to Arcadius. It was not meant to be forever, this splitting of the eagle's wings, but forever it would prove to be. The Eastern Empire found its rhythm in the decades that followed. While the West struggled with barbarian invasions and political chaos, Constantinople grew ever more magnificent. Ships from India and Ceylon brought spices and silk to its harbors, while merchants from Russia descended the great rivers with furs and amber. The city's population swelled beyond anything the ancient world had known, a cosmopolitan mixture of Greeks and Romans, Armenians and Syrians, Jews and Goths, all bound together by commerce and the Christian faith that Constantine had embraced. In the palace halls, courtiers moved with practiced grace, their ceremonies as elaborate as they were ancient. The emperor, whoever he might be at any given moment, was no longer merely a man. He was the earthly representative of divine will, his purple robes heavy with gold thread and precious stones. When he spoke, it was with the voice of God himself, or so the carefully constructed rituals suggested. This was no rough military camp as Rome had once been, but a court of refined sophistication, where philosophy and theology were debated with the same passion that had once been reserved for gladiatorial contests. Yet beneath the silk and ceremony, the Eastern Empire possessed something that would prove more valuable than all the gold in its treasury: resilience. When Alaric sacked Rome in 410, Constantinople barely stirred. When Attila the Hun turned his terrible gaze westward, the Eastern Emperor Theodosius II paid him tribute and watched the storm pass by. When the last Western emperor was deposed in 476, the East simply shrugged and carried on, for in their minds the empire had never truly divided. There was still one Rome, and it lived on the Bosporus. The city grew more beautiful with each passing generation. Artisans from across the known world came to adorn its churches and palaces with mosaics that seemed to capture light itself and hold it prisoner in tiny pieces on colored glass. The University of Constantinople became the greatest center of learning in the Christian world, where scholars preserved the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome, while theologians wrestled with the mysteries of faith. Libraries filled with manuscripts copied by patient monks, their pages illuminated with gold leaf and brilliant pigments that would survive the centuries to come. In the early years of the 6th century, as morning mist rose from the Golden Horn, and fishermen cast their nets in waters that reflected 1,000 years of history, few could have imagined the glory that was yet to come. The Eastern Empire, though its people still called themselves Romans, had found its own identity, its own rhythm, its own voice. It was no longer merely the surviving half of something greater, but something magnificent in its own right. The foundation Constantine had laid was more than just stone and mortar. It was an idea made manifest, that civilization could endure, that knowledge could be preserved, that beauty could flourish even as the world around it crumbled into darkness. In the harbors of Constantinople, merchants unloaded treasures from lands so distant they seemed like dreams, while in the streets children played games their ancestors in Rome would have recognized, speaking a language that was becoming something new. Not quite Latin, not quite Greek, but something altogether Byzantine. As the sun set over the 7 hills of this new Rome, painting the waters of the Bosporus in shades of amber and gold, the city settled into evening prayer. Church bells rang across the neighborhoods, calling the faithful to vespers, while in the palace, oil lamps flickered in windows that looked out over an empire that stretched from the Danube to the deserts of Syria. This was the Byzantine world in its youth, strong and confident, wealthy and cultured, ready to embrace a destiny that would carry it across more than 1,000 years of triumph and tragedy, glory and suffering, until at last it would face its final sunset in a city that had seen the rise and fall of nations beyond counting. In the spring of 527, a peasant's nephew named Petrus Sabatius ascended to the throne of the Eastern Empire, taking the name Justinian. He was not a handsome man. Contemporaries described him as short and stocky, with a round face and thinning hair. but his eyes burned with an ambition that would reshape the world. Beside him stood Theodora, once an actress from the Hippodrome's dusty stages, now Empress of the Romans. Her intelligence as sharp as any blade, and her beauty legendary even among those who despised her humble origins. Together, they would create something magnificent and terrible, a golden age that would blaze across the 6th century like a comet, illuminating the darkness that had settled over much of the known world. Justinian dreamed not of conquest, but of restoration. He would reclaim the scattered territories of the old Roman Empire and reunite them under one crown, one law, one faith. It was a dream as grand as it was impossible, yet for a brief, shining moment, it almost came true. The emperor's days began before dawn in the palace's private chapel, where he would spend long hours in prayer, his voice joining with those of the monks in ancient hymns that echoed through marble halls. Justinian was deeply religious, some said obsessively so. But his faith was not passive contemplation. It was an active force that drove him to create, to build, to perfect the world according to divine will. When he emerged from prayer, it was to dive into the endless work of governing an empire, reading reports from distant provinces, consulting with generals and lawyers, architects and theologians, always pushing, always demanding more. Theodora, meanwhile, held court in her own apartments, where silk hangings from China caught the morning light and Persian carpets muffled the footsteps of visiting dignitaries. She had not forgotten her origins among the common people of Constantinople, and her policies often favored those whom the aristocracy preferred to ignore: women, slaves, and the urban poor. Her intelligence was formidable, her political instincts unerring, and more than once she would prove to be the stronger partner in their remarkable marriage. The first great project of Justinian's reign was not military, but legal. For centuries, Roman law had accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of statutes and precedents, contradictory rulings and obsolete regulations that made justice as much a matter of chance as of right. The emperor assembled a team of the finest legal minds in the empire and set them a task that seemed impossible: to organize, clarify, and codify the entire body of Roman law into a single, coherent system. For 6 years they labored, and when they finished, they had created the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, which would become the foundation of legal systems across Europe for the next 1,000 years. But law was only the beginning. In 532, the city erupted in the most dangerous riots of the empire's history. The Blues and Greens, the rival factions that supported different chariot racing teams in the Hippodrome, joined forces against the emperor, burning much of the city centre and proclaiming a new ruler. For 6 days, Constantinople burned while Justinian cowered in his palace, preparing to flee by ship. It was Theodora who stiffened his resolve with words that would echo through history. May I never live to see the day when those who meet me do not call me Empress. If you wish to flee, Caesar, well and good. But I shall stay. I love the old saying, "The purple is the noblest burial shroud." Justinian stayed, and his general Belisarius trapped the rioters in the Hippodrome, slaughtering 30,000 in a single afternoon. The Nika riots, as they came to be known, were finished, but so was much of the city centre. Where others might have seen only destruction, Justinian saw opportunity. He would rebuild Constantinople greater than ever before, and at its heart would rise a church unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, took just 5 years to build. But those years witnessed the creation of architectural genius that would never be equaled. The emperor brought together the finest architects of the age, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, men who understood not only stone and mortar, but mathematics and engineering, light and space, and the very mysteries of creating heaven on earth. Justinian spared no expense. Marble columns were brought from temples across the empire, while mosaics of unprecedented beauty began to take shape on walls and domes. When the great church was finally completed in 537, even the workers who had built it stopped to stare in wonder. The central dome seemed to float impossibly above the nave, supported by nothing visible to mortal eyes, while light poured through windows to illuminate mosaics that seemed to move and breathe with divine life. On the day of its consecration, Justinian himself is said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." It was not an idle boast. The Hagia Sophia was the largest enclosed space in the world, a miracle of engineering that would stand as testimony to Byzantine glory for nearly 1,000 years. But Justinian's greatest dream still lay ahead. In 533, he sent Belisarius across the Mediterranean with an army of just 15,000 men to reconquer North Africa from the Vandals. It seemed like madness. The Vandals had held these rich provinces for a century. Their fleets commanded the western Mediterranean, and their king Gelimer was no weakling. Yet within a year, Belisarius had shattered the Vandal kingdom and restored imperial rule from Morocco to Tripoli. The wealth of Africa flowed back to Constantinople, filling the emperor's treasury and financing even greater ambitions. Next came Italy, where the Ostrogothic kingdom had ruled since the fall of the Western Empire. This campaign would prove far more difficult. It would drag on for 20 years, devastating the peninsula and costing hundreds of thousands of lives. But when it was finished, Rome itself was once again part of the Roman Empire, and imperial banners flew from the Alps to Sicily. For a brief moment, the Mediterranean was once again a Roman lake, just as it had been in the days of Augustus and Trajan. The emperor and empress held court in a palace that had become the wonder of the world. Ambassadors from distant lands, Frankish chiefs and Ethiopian princes, Persian nobles and Chinese merchants came to marvel at the splendor of Constantinople. The imperial couple received them in the Chrysotriklinos, the Golden Hall, where mechanical lions roared and golden birds sang in jeweled trees, while the emperor himself sat motionless on his throne, clothed in robes so heavy with gold and precious stones that he seemed more statue than man. Yet even in this golden age, shadows were gathering. The plague that would bear Justinian's name arrived in Constantinople in 542, carried by ships from Egypt, where it had already devastated Alexandria. It spread through the crowded streets like wildfire, killing perhaps 1/3 of the city's population and spreading throughout the empire. Even Justinian himself fell ill, though he survived, while thousands around him perished. The empire's resources, already strained by constant warfare, were pushed to the breaking point. Theodora died in 548, her passing marking the beginning of the end of the Golden Age. Without her counsel and strength, Justinian seemed to lose something essential. He became increasingly absorbed in theological disputes, spending his final years trying to reconcile the competing interpretations of Christian doctrine that threatened to tear the empire apart. The reconquered territories in the west proved impossible to hold. Italy fell to the Lombards just years after its costly reconquest, while Africa slipped away piece by piece. When Justinian died in 565, he left behind an empire that was both greater and more fragile than the one he had inherited. The Hagia Sophia still dominated Constantinople's skyline, the legal code still governed millions of subjects, and the imperial territories still stretched from Spain to the Euphrates. But the treasury was empty, the army exhausted, and new enemies were gathering on every frontier. The Golden Age was ending, but its achievements would outlast the darkness to come. Monuments to human ambition and divine inspiration that would inspire wonder for generations yet unborn. The decades following Justinian's death brought trials that tested the very soul of the empire. Like waves crashing against the sea walls of Constantinople, crisis after crisis broke upon the Byzantine world, each one threatening to wash away what centuries had built. Yet through it all, the empire endured, bending but never breaking, finding new strength in adversity and new purpose in suffering. In 568, just 3 years after Justinian's passing, the Lombards swept into Italy like a plague of locusts. These Germanic warriors had learned the art of war in the steppes beyond the Danube, and they fell upon the war-weary peninsula with terrible efficiency. City after city fell to their advance, Milan, Pavia, Spoleto, until the empire's Italian territories were reduced to scattered islands of resistance. Rome itself, the port of Ravenna, and a few coastal strongholds that could be supplied by sea. The dream of reuniting the old Roman Empire crumbled like parchment in flames. But Italy was only the beginning. Along the Danube frontier, Slavic tribes pressed southward in endless migrations, their ox carts heavy with families seeking new homes in the fertile valleys of the Balkans. Unlike previous invaders, these Slavs came not to conquer and move on, but to settle permanently, bringing their own language, customs, and gods to lands that had been Roman for centuries. Greek cities that had flourished since the days of Alexander found themselves surrounded by Slavic villages, their ancient culture slowly transformed by this quiet but relentless infiltration. In the east, the eternal enemy stirred once more. The Persian Empire under Khosrow II launched invasion after invasion, their armored cavalry thundering across the Mesopotamian plains, while their siege engines battered the walls of Antioch and Damascus. For 26 years, the war raged back and forth across Syria and Anatolia, consuming treasure and lives in quantities that would have staggered earlier generations. Persian armies reached the very shores of the Bosporus, while Persian gold funded revolts and rebellions throughout the empire's heartland. Emperor Heraclius, who came to the throne in 610, seemed an unlikely savior. He was middle-aged and scholarly, more comfortable with books than battlefields, yet he possessed something that his predecessors had lacked, the ability to inspire others to believe in seemingly impossible dreams. As Persian armies camped within sight of Constantinople's walls, Heraclius made a decision that shocked his contemporaries. He would abandon the traditional Roman strategy of defensive warfare and instead carry the fight deep into enemy territory. In 622, leaving Constantinople defended by its great walls and the prayers of its people, Heraclius led his army into the mountains of Anatolia. For 6 years he fought a guerrilla campaign that would have done justice to the greatest generals of antiquity, striking at Persian supply lines, liberating captured cities, and slowly building an alliance with the empire's Christian subjects who had suffered under Persian rule. His final victory came in 627 at Nineveh, where his army shattered the last Persian host and sent Khosrov II fleeing to his capital at Ctesiphon. The emperor returned to Constantinople in triumph, bearing with him the most precious relic in Christendom, the true cross which the Persians had carried away from Jerusalem years before. The city erupted in celebration as Heraclius processed through the streets, the cross gleaming in the sunlight, while church bells rang from every quarter. It seemed as though divine providence had vindicated the empire's faith, rewarding its suffering with miraculous deliverance. Yet even as the citizens celebrated, new clouds were gathering on the southern horizon. In the deserts of Arabia, a merchant named Muhammad had begun preaching a new faith, one that would soon set the world ablaze with religious fervor. The Arab armies that emerged from those desert wastes moved with the speed of sandstorms and the conviction of true believers. Damascus fell in 636, Jerusalem in 638, Alexandria in 642. Within a generation, the empire lost its richest provinces, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, to warriors who fought with the fury of those who believed they carried out God's will. The loss of Egypt was particularly devastating. For centuries, the great granary of the Nile had fed Constantinople's hungry millions, while Egyptian merchants had carried Byzantine gold to the markets of India and Ceylon. Now, all that wealth flowed to Damascus and Baghdad, enriching the caliphs while the empire struggled to feed its remaining subjects. Heraclius, the great victor over Persia, lived just long enough to see his life's work undone by enemies he had never imagined. When death took him in 641, he was said to whisper, "Peace be with you, Syria, and what an excellent country this is for the enemy." The losses went beyond territory and treasure. With the Arab conquests, the empire lost much of its cosmopolitan character, becoming more Greek, more orthodox, more intensely focused on Constantinople and its immediate hinterland. The great theological schools of Alexandria and Antioch fell silent, their scholars scattered or converted, while the empire's intellectual life became increasingly centered on the monasteries of Mount Athos and the University of Constantinople. In 726, Emperor Leo III made a decision that would convulse the empire for more than a century. Convinced that God was punishing the Byzantines for their veneration of religious images, he ordered the destruction of icons throughout the empire. The movement, known as iconoclasm, the breaking of images, tore Byzantine society apart. Monks and nuns who refused to surrender their precious icons were tortured and executed, while churches that had taken centuries to decorate were stripped bare in a matter of days. The iconoclastic controversy was more than just a religious dispute. It was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of the divine and how human beings could approach the sacred. The iconoclasts, drawing on ancient traditions that forbade the creation of graven images, argued that attempting to depict Christ or the saints was both blasphemous and impossible, since the divine nature could not be captured in mere paint and gold. Their opponents, led by monks and popular preachers, insisted that icons were windows into heaven, allowing the faithful to commune with the saints and contemplate the mysteries of faith. For more than a century, the empire tortured itself over this question. Emperors rose and fell based on their position on icons, while families were divided and friendships destroyed. The monastery of Styzudios in Constantinople became a center of resistance to iconoclasm, its monks smuggling icons to safety and composing hymns that kept the old traditions alive. Meanwhile, iconoclastic emperors like Constantine V, whom his enemies called the dung-named, pursued their policies with fanatic determination, convinced that only the complete elimination of religious art could restore God's favor. The controversy finally ended in 843, when Empress Theodora, widow of the last iconoclastic emperor, restored the veneration of icons in a ceremony that would be celebrated annually as the triumph of orthodoxy. Churches throughout the empire were redecorated with new mosaics and frescoes, while monks emerged from hiding to resume their ancient practices. Yet the damage had been done. Countless works of art had been destroyed forever, while the empire's unity had been shattered by decades of religious civil war. Through all these trials, the loss of territory, the Arab conquests, the iconoclastic controversy, the empire somehow endured. Like gold refined in fire, it emerged from each crisis, smaller perhaps, but purer in its essential character. The sprawling, multicultural empire of Justinian's day had become something more focused and intense, a Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian state centered on Constantinople, bound together by shared faith and common suffering. In the monasteries of Mount Athos and the Studite houses of Constantinople, monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, preserving the wisdom of ages past for generations yet unborn. In the University of Constantinople, scholars debated the finer points of theology and philosophy, keeping alive the intellectual traditions of ancient Greece and Rome. And in the Hagia Sophia, now restored to its full glory after the end of iconoclasm, the faithful gathered to sing hymns that had echoed through these halls for centuries, their voices rising like incense toward the golden dome that seemed to touch the very threshold of heaven. The empire had survived its trial by fire, but the flames had changed it forever. What emerged was not the universal state that Constantine and Justinian had envisioned, but something smaller and more resilient, a bastion of Orthodox Christianity that would guard the eastern approaches to Europe for centuries to come, facing whatever trials awaited with the hard-won wisdom of those who had already endured the unendurable. The morning sun cast long shadows across the waters of the Golden Horn as the great chain was raised between its shores, sealing Constantinople's harbour against the fleet that darkened the horizon. It was the summer of 717, and for the second time in less than a century, an Arab army had come to claim the city that called itself the New Rome. Their ships filled the sea from shore to shore, while their land forces, numbering perhaps 80,000 men, spread across the hills of Thrace like a plague of bronze and steel. The Caliph's generals had planned this campaign with methodical precision. Previous Arab expeditions had failed because they could not maintain their supply lines across the hostile waters of the Mediterranean. But this time they had come prepared for a siege that might last years. Their fleet carried enough provisions to feed an army through multiple winters, while their engineers had brought the finest siege equipment that Syrian workshops could produce. They were confident that Constantinople, weakened by decades of internal strife and external pressure, would fall within months. They had not counted on Emperor Leo III, the Isaurian peasant who had seized the throne just 2 years before. Leo was not a man of refined education or courtly graces. He had risen through the ranks of the army by virtue of courage and cunning, learning warfare in the mountain valleys of Anatolia, where every village had to be both fortress and farm. When the Arab army settled into its siege lines around the great land wall, Leo was ready for them. The siege began as these things always did, with a thunderous barrage from the Arab catapults and mangonels that hurled stones the size of wine barrels against Constantinople's ancient fortifications. But the Great Wall had been built to withstand such assaults. Its double line of fortifications, towers, and elaborate gates had turned back every enemy for more than 3 centuries. Day after day, the Arab engineers filled in a great moat and brought their siege towers forward, only to see them destroyed by the defenders' counterfire or consumed by the mysterious weapon that had become the empire's most closely guarded secret. Greek fire, the liquid flame that burned on water and could not be extinguished by conventional means, had first appeared in Byzantine arsenals during the previous century. Its exact composition was known only to a handful of imperial craftsmen, each sworn to secrecy on pain of death, but its effects were terrifyingly obvious to anyone who faced it in battle. Launched from bronze siphons mounted on the city's walls or sprayed from special galleys in the harbor, Greek fire could turn a wooden siege tower into an inferno in moments, while enemy ships, caught in its embrace, became floating furnaces that no amount of water could quench. As autumn gave way to winter, the Arab army found itself trapped in an increasingly desperate situation. The fierce cold of a Thracian winter, far harsher than anything the desert warriors had experienced, killed more men than Byzantine weapons. Supply ships from Syria were intercepted by Greek fire galleys or driven off by winter storms, while Bulgarian raiders harassed the army's land-based supply lines. Disease spread through the crowded camps, claiming thousands of lives, while desertion thinned the ranks of those who had marched north with such confidence. Inside the city, life continued with the stubborn rhythm of a people who had learned to endure. Merchants still sold their wares in the covered markets, though prices rose steadily as the siege tightened. Children still played in the narrow streets, though their games increasingly involved mock battles between Christians and Saracens. In the churches, priests led prayers for deliverance that rose like smoke from thousands of oil lamps, while in the Hagia Sophia, the Patriarch conducted special services asking for divine intervention in the city's hour of need. The Emperor himself walked the walls each day, his purple cloak exchanged for a soldier's practical armor, speaking with the defenders and checking the great engines of war that crowned each tower. Leo had learned long ago that leadership meant sharing the dangers of those he commanded, and his presence on the walls, calm, confident, unafraid, did more to maintain morale than any number of speeches or proclamations. When Arab emissaries came under flags of truce to offer generous terms for surrender, Leo's response was brief. "The city of Constantine will stand as long as Christ protects it." Spring brought no relief to the besiegers. A second Arab fleet, sent from Egypt to reinforce the first, was met in the waters near Gallipoli by an imperial squadron that had crept out of the Golden Horn under cover of darkness. The battle that followed lit up the night sky as Greek fire turned the narrow strait into a furnace, destroying most of the Arab reinforcements and sending the survivors fleeing back toward Alexandria. Meanwhile, Bulgarian armies, encouraged by Byzantine gold and promises of tribute, began attacking the Arab camps from the rear, forcing the already exhausted besiegers to fight on two fronts. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter. A harsh winter had been followed by an even harsher spring, with late snows and bitter winds that killed the tender shoots of grain across Anatolia and Thrace. Famine stalked both armies, but the Arabs, dependent on increasingly tenuous supply lines, suffered far more than the defenders, who could draw on carefully hoarded reserves stored in the city's countless cisterns and granaries. By midsummer of 718, the Arab army was a shadow of its former self, decimated by disease, hunger, and constant harassment from enemies who seemed to multiply like the heads of the mythical Hydra. In August, after 13 months of futile siege, the Arab commanders finally admitted defeat. Their withdrawal was more a rout than a retreat, harassed at every step by Byzantine cavalry and Bulgarian auxiliaries who had learned to work together despite centuries of mutual hostility. Of the great army that had marched confidently toward Constantinople, only a fraction survived to reach the safety of Syrian territory, while the massive fleet that had once darkened the Aegean was reduced to a handful of battered galleys limping home with news of disaster. The failure of the Second Arab Siege of Constantinople marked a turning point in the long struggle between cross and crescent. Never again would the caliphs mount such a massive assault on the imperial capital, though Arab raids would continue to probe Byzantine defenses for generations to come. More importantly, the siege established the empire's reputation as the bulwark of Christian Europe, the fortress that stood between civilization and the forces of conquest that swept out of Asia. Emperor Leo III did not rest on his laurels. In the years following the siege, he reorganized the empire's military system around the theme system, a brilliant innovation that combined military service with agricultural settlement. Each theme was both an administrative district and a military command, populated by soldier farmers who received land grants in exchange for military service. When enemies approached, these farmer soldiers could rapidly mobilize to defend their homes, while in peacetime they provided the agricultural surplus that kept the empire fed and the treasury supplied with taxes. The great walls of Constantinople, scarred by countless battles but still standing proudly against the sky, became a symbol of imperial endurance that inspired awe throughout the known world. Pilgrims and merchants, diplomats and scholars, all came to marvel at the city that had turned back the mightiest armies of Islam, while chroniclers in distant lands recorded the miraculous preservation of the Christian empire as evidence of divine favor. Yet the empire's enemies did not disappear. They adapted. Arab strategy shifted from massive sieges to swift raids designed to capture booty and prisoners rather than territory. Bulgarian khans and Slavic princes probed the northern frontiers with increasing boldness, while in the west, new powers, the Franks, the Lombards, the emerging maritime republics of Italy, began to challenge Byzantine control of the Mediterranean trade routes that had enriched Constantinople for centuries. The defenders adapted as well. Imperial engineers perfected new versions of Greek fire, creating weapons that could be deployed from ships or carried by individual soldiers. The imperial fleet, rebuilt after the devastation of the Arab Wars, developed new tactics that emphasized speed and maneuverability over the massive, lumbering warships of earlier centuries. Most importantly, the empire's diplomatic service, perhaps the most sophisticated in the medieval world, learned to play enemies against each other, using gold and promises to prevent the formation of dangerous coalitions. As the 8th century drew to a close, Constantinople stood secure behind its walls, its churches filled with the sound of thanksgiving hymns, its markets bustling with merchants from across the known world. The great siege had been survived, the empire had endured, and the golden dome of the Hagia Sophia still caught the first light of dawn, sending its radiance across a city that had learned to find strength in adversity and hope in the darkest hours of trial. The century that followed the great siege of Constantinople brought changes that crept through the empire like shadows at twilight, gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but ultimately transforming everything they touched. The heroic age of Leo III and his successors gave way to an era of complexity and contradiction, where brilliant victories alternated with devastating defeats, and moments of renewed glory were overshadowed by signs of an empire growing slowly but inexorably weaker. In the early years of the 9th century, Empress Irene ruled alone, the first woman to claim the imperial title in her own right, rather than as regent for a son or husband. She was a figure of remarkable contradictions, deeply pious, yet ruthlessly pragmatic, genuinely concerned for her subjects' welfare, yet capable of ordering the blinding of her own son to secure her throne. Under her rule, the iconoclastic controversy finally began to wind down, as exhaustion and practical necessity overcame theological passion. The empire needed unity more than it needed doctrinal purity, and Irene understood this better than most of her contemporaries. Yet even as internal peace returned, external pressures multiplied. Into West, a new power had emerged that would challenge Byzantine pretensions to Roman legitimacy. On Christmas Day of the year 800, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon the head of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. The ceremony took place in the very heart of the old empire, in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome itself, and its implications were unmistakable. There were now two claimants to the Roman inheritance, and the division would complicate European politics for centuries to come. The Byzantines were appalled. In their view, there could be only one Roman Empire, and it resided in Constantinople, the new Rome that Constantine had founded 5 centuries before. Charlemagne was nothing more than a barbarian chieftain with pretensions, his crown a meaningless bauble bestowed by a bishop who had no authority to create emperors. Yet reality had a way of intruding on ideological purity. Charlemagne's empire controlled vast territories that had once been Roman, commanded armies that the Byzantines could not hope to match, and possessed resources that dwarfed what remained in the imperial treasury. The emergence of the Carolingian Empire forced Constantinople to reconsider its place in the world. No longer could the Byzantines claim to be the sole heirs of Rome. They were now merely one of several powers competing for dominance in a fragmenting world. This realization brought with it a subtle but profound shift in imperial psychology. The expansive confidence of earlier centuries began to give way to a more defensive mentality, focused on preserving what remained rather than reclaiming what had been lost. Meanwhile, new enemies appeared on every frontier. In the north, the Bulgars under Khan Krum proved themselves to be as formidable as any foe the empire had faced. In 811, Emperor Nicephorus I led a massive expedition against the Bulgarian capital of Pliska, confident that overwhelming force would crush these troublesome neighbors once and for all. Instead, the imperial army was annihilated in a mountain pass, and Nicephorus himself was killed. The first emperor to die in battle since Valens fell at Adrianople more than 4 centuries before. Khan Krum had the emperor's skull turned into a drinking cup, from which he toasted his victories over the Romans. The defeat at Pliska sent shockwaves throughout the empire. If a Bulgarian chieftain could destroy an imperial army and kill an emperor, what did this say about the empire's supposedly divine mandate? Revolts broke out in several themes, while ambitious generals began calculating whether the throne might be seized by someone with better military credentials than the current occupant. For a generation, internal warfare consumed resources that might have been used to strengthen the frontiers or rebuild the economy. Yet the empire possessed an almost miraculous capacity for renewal. In 867, a new dynasty came to power when Basil V, a Macedonian peasant of extraordinary ambition and ability, murdered his way to the throne. The Macedonian dynasty would rule for nearly 2 centuries, presiding over what historians would later call the Byzantine Renaissance, a period of military conquest, economic prosperity, and cultural flowering that recalled the glorious days of Justinian. Under Basil I and his successors, imperial armies once again marched deep into enemy territory. The Arabs, weakened by their own internal divisions, were pushed back across Syria and Mesopotamia, while in the west, Byzantine forces reconquered much of southern Italy from the Lombards and Arabs who had seized it centuries before. The imperial fleet, rebuilt with newer and faster ships, swept Arab pirates from the eastern Mediterranean and reopened trade routes that had been closed for generations. The reconquests brought more than territory. They brought wealth. Gold flowed into Constantinople's treasury from the taxes of newly recovered provinces, while Italian silk workshops and Syrian spice merchants once again contributed to the empire's prosperity. The capital itself grew more magnificent, its streets widened and paved with marble, its churches decorated with mosaics that surpassed even those of Justinian's age. The University of Constantinople attracted scholars from across Europe, while the imperial library grew fat with manuscripts copied from libraries in Baghdad and Cordoba, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever. Yet beneath the glittering surface, structural problems were growing that would eventually prove fatal to the empire's continued prosperity. The theme system, which had served so well in the desperate years of the Arab invasions, began to break down as successful generals accumulated vast estates and private armies that rivaled the imperial forces. These military aristocrats, families like the Phocas, Skleros, and Melenos clans, became virtually independent rulers in their own provinces, paying lip service to Constantinople while pursuing their own interests with increasing boldness. The emperors found themselves caught in an impossible situation. They needed the military aristocrats to defend the frontiers and lead the armies that had won such spectacular victories. Yet these same men posed the greatest threat to imperial authority. Ambitious generals repeatedly launched revolts against the throne, forcing emperors to divert resources from external campaigns to suppress internal rebellions. The empire began to consume itself from within, its strength sapped by civil wars that accomplished nothing except the enrichment of mercenary armies and the devastation of provinces that had the misfortune to serve as battlefields. Economic pressures added to the empire's difficulties. The conquests of the 10th century had been expensive, requiring massive expenditures on armies, fleets, and fortifications that strained even the enlarged treasury. Meanwhile, new competitors appeared in the Mediterranean trade that had long been a Byzantine monopoly. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, built fleets that could match anything Constantinople possessed, while their merchants proved more adaptable and aggressive than their Byzantine counterparts. Gradually, control of the lucrative trade routes to Asia began to slip from Greek hands into Italian ones. The empire's currency, the gold solidus that had been the most stable money in the world for 7 centuries, began to show signs of debasement as emperors faced ever-growing expenses and diminishing revenues. The careful fiscal policies that had sustained the empire through its darkest hours gave way to short-term expedients, debasing the coinage, selling offices to the highest bidder, imposing crushing taxes on whatever provinces remained loyal. These measures provided temporary relief, but at the cost of long-term stability. Religious divisions also began to reappear, though in new forms. The iconoclastic controversy was finally settled, but it was replaced by other theological disputes that proved equally divisive. The Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope in Rome, once uneasy allies in the face of common enemies, began to assert competing claims to authority over the Christian world. Differences in doctrine, liturgy, and ecclesiastical organization that had once seemed minor became sources of major conflict as each side sought to establish its supremacy over the other. The final break came in 1054 when papal legates placed a bull of excommunication on the altar of the Hagia Sophia, formally severing the ties between Eastern and Western Christianity. Patriarch Michael Cerularius responded by excommunicating the papal legates, creating a schism that would divide the Christian world for centuries to come. The empire, which had once seen itself as the defender of universal Christianity, now found itself at the head of merely one branch of the faith, Orthodox Christianity, while the other branch, Roman Catholicism, looked to the Pope and increasingly to the growing power of Western European kingdoms. As the 11th century progressed, these accumulated pressures began to overwhelm the empire's capacity to respond. The military aristocracy grew ever more independent, carving out virtual kingdoms in Anatolia and the Balkans while paying only nominal allegiance to Constantinople. The economy stagnated as trade routes shifted westward, and the empire's manufacturing centers declined in the face of Italian competition. The army, once the finest fighting force in the world, became increasingly dependent on foreign mercenaries whose loyalty could be bought and sold like any other commodity. In 1071, these trends culminated in disaster at the Battle of Manzikert, where Emperor Romanos IV led the imperial army against the Seljuk Turks in the mountains of Armenia. The battle was lost not through enemy superiority, but through treachery and confusion in the Byzantine ranks, as rival factions within the army pursued their own agendas, even in the face of mortal danger. Romanos himself was captured, becoming the first emperor to fall into enemy hands since the darkest days of the Persian Wars 6 centuries before. The aftermath of Manzikert was even more catastrophic than the battle itself. With the emperor a prisoner and the army scattered, Anatolia lay open to Turkish invasion. Within a decade, the Seljuks had overrun most of the empire's Asian territories, establishing the Sultanate of Rum with its capital at Nicaea, just a few miles from Constantinople itself. The empire that had once stretched from Italy to the Euphrates was reduced to little more than Constantinople and its immediate surroundings, plus scattered holdings in the Balkans and southern Italy. Yet even in this darkest hour, the empire endured. A new emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, came to the throne in 1081, determined to restore Byzantine fortunes through whatever means necessary. If the empire could no longer rely on its own strength, then it would seek allies wherever they could be found, even among the barbarian kingdoms of Western Europe that had once been dismissed with contempt. In 1195, Alexios sent an embassy to Pope Urban II, seeking military assistance against the Turks who threatened the very existence of Eastern Christianity. The emperor's plea would have consequences that no one could have imagined. Within months, Urban II was preaching the First Crusade, calling upon the knights of Western Europe to march east and reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. Alexios had hoped for a few thousand mercenaries. Instead, he got tens of thousands of armed pilgrims whose religious fervor was matched only by their ignorance of Eastern customs and their suspicion of Greek Orthodox Christianity. The Crusades would bring both salvation and destruction to the Byzantine Empire. Salvation in the short term, as Crusader victories restored much of Anatolia to imperial control, but destruction in the long run, as cultural misunderstandings and competing ambitions would eventually turn the Crusaders against Constantinople itself. For now, though, as the first Crusader armies approached the Golden Horn in the winter of 1096, there was still hope that the empire might yet recover its former glory, that the shadows of decline might give way once more to the brilliant light of renewal. The morning of April 13th, 1204 dawned grey and cold over Constantinople, the waters of the Golden Horn reflecting a sky heavy with the promise of rain. From the walls of the great city, watchmen could see the Crusader fleet anchored in the harbour. Not the familiar sight of Byzantine dromons with their distinctive Greek fire siphons, but the high-sided cogs and galleys of Venice, their red banners snapping in the wind like drops of blood against the pale sky. For 3 days, the Fourth Crusade had been preparing for an assault that would shake the foundations of the Christian world. It had not been supposed to end this way. When Pope Innocent III had called for this new expedition to the Holy Land, the intention had been to strike directly at the heart of Muslim power in Egypt, avoiding the long and perilous overland route that had cost so many lives in previous crusades. The Crusaders had gathered in Venice, that proud maritime republic whose merchants had grown rich carrying pilgrims and warriors to the east, and there they had struck what seemed like a reasonable bargain with Doge Enrico Dandolo. Dandolo was ancient even by the standards of his time. Some said he was 90 years old, others claimed he was over 100, and nearly blind, his eyes milky with cataracts that had stolen his sight, but not his cunning. He had offered to transport the Crusader army to Egypt in exchange for a payment of 85,000 marks of silver, a sum that seemed manageable when the agreement was signed, but proved impossible to raise when the time came to pay. The Crusaders found themselves stranded in Venice, unable to afford passage, yet unable to return home without losing face before all of Christendom. It was then that Dandolo had made his fateful suggestion. The Crusaders could work off their debt by helping Venice reclaim the city of Zara, which had recently defected to Hungarian protection. Never mind that Zara was a Christian city, ruled by a Christian king who had taken the cross himself. Business was business, and Venice had investments to protect. The assault on Zara had been swift and brutal, but it was only the beginning of the Crusades' deviation from its holy purpose. From Zara, the expedition had been lured further off course by the promises of Alexios Angelos, a Byzantine prince who claimed that his father, the deposed Emperor Isaac II, had been wrongfully imprisoned by his brother. Restore Isaac to the throne, Alexios promised, and Byzantium would pay the Crusaders' debts to Venice, provide troops for the conquest of Egypt, and heal the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity that had divided the Church for 150 years. It was an offer too tempting to refuse, even though it meant attacking fellow Christians in the very city that had been the bulwark of Eastern Christianity for nearly 9 centuries. The first assault on Constantinople in July 1203 had been almost anticlimactically successful. The walls that had turned back Arabs and Bulgars, Avars and Russians crumbled before the innovative siege techniques of the Western Knights. The Crusaders breached the Golden Horn's great chain, landed troops on the European shore, and set fires that consumed entire neighborhoods. Emperor Alexios III fled in the night, abandoning his capital to save his own life, and the Crusaders installed Isaac II and his son Alexios IV as co-emperors, confident that their promises would soon be fulfilled. But the promises proved as ephemeral as morning mist. The restored emperors discovered that their treasury was empty, their subjects hostile to the Latin occupation, and their ability to deliver on their commitments non-existent. Anti-Latin riots broke out in the streets of Constantinople, while in the palace a new usurper named Alexios Viaidoukas strangled Alexios IV and imprisoned his father, declaring that no more tribute would be paid to the Western invaders. The Crusaders camped outside the city walls through the bitter winter of 1203 to 1204, found themselves in an impossible position. They had spent their last resources on an expedition that had brought them nothing but expenses and enemies. Venice's merchants pressed for payment of debts that continued to accumulate interest, while the common soldiers grew restless and mutinous. Some spoke of abandoning the entire enterprise and returning home, but others, led by the most ambitious nobles, began to whisper of a different solution. If Constantinople would not willingly provide the wealth they needed, then perhaps it should be taken by force. The final assault began at dawn on April 9th, 1204, with a coordinated attack on the sea-facing wall that had never been breached in all the city's long history. Venetian ships, modified with flying bridges and scaling ladders, approached the wall, while catapults and mangonels hurled stones and firepots at the defenders. For 3 days, the battle raged with unprecedented fury, the Crusaders driven forward by desperation and greed, the Byzantines fighting with the courage of those who knew they were defending not just their city, but their entire civilization. The breakthrough came when a small group of Crusaders managed to scale the wall near the Pétion Gate, overpowering the guards and opening the way for their comrades. Within hours, the entire sea-facing wall was in Crusader hands, and Byzantine resistance began to collapse. Emperor Alexios V fled the city in a fishing boat, leaving his subjects to face the storm alone. What followed was 3 days of pillaging that surpassed in scale and savagery anything Constantinople had experienced in 9 centuries of existence. The Crusaders, many of whom had not been paid for months, fell upon the greatest city in the world like wolves upon a flock of sheep. Churches were stripped of their golden altars and jeweled chalices. Monasteries were ransacked for their illuminated manuscripts and precious relics, and private homes were invaded by soldiers seeking anything of value. The Hagia Sophia, the great church that had been the pride of Eastern Christianity for nearly 7 centuries, suffered particularly grievous damage. Crusader soldiers smashed the silver iconostasis, melted down golden vessels to make coins, and even brought horses and mules into the sacred space to carry away their loot more efficiently. A prostitute sat on the patriarch's throne and sang bawdy songs while drunken knights danced around her, their laughter echoing through the dome that had once resounded with the most beautiful liturgical music in the world. The Library of Constantinople, which had preserved the works of ancient Greece and Rome through the darkest centuries of the Middle Ages, was destroyed almost entirely. Manuscripts that had survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Arab conquests, and the iconoclastic controversy were burned for fuel or torn apart for parchment. The loss to human knowledge was incalculable. Entire works of classical literature, scientific treatises, and historical chronicles vanished forever in those 3 terrible days. Perhaps most tragic of all was the destruction of the city's artistic treasures. The bronze horses that had once adorned the hippodrome were shipped to Venice, where they would adorn the facade of St. Mark's Basilica. The great bronze statue of Athena, which had stood in the city since Constantine's time, was melted down for its metal. Countless mosaics, frescoes, and sculptures that had taken centuries to create were destroyed in moments by soldiers who saw only the precious materials from which they were made. When the looting finally ended, the Crusaders faced the question of what to do with their conquest. They had destroyed the Byzantine Empire, but they had not thereby created a sustainable replacement. The solution they adopted was to divide the empire's territories among themselves, creating a patchwork of Latin states that would prove as ephemeral as they were artificial. Baldwin of Flanders became the first Latin emperor of Constantinople, ruling over a truncated state that controlled little more than the city itself and its immediate surroundings. The Venetians, more practical than their knightly allies, claimed the choicest commercial territories, the ports and trading stations that would allow them to dominate eastern Mediterranean commerce for centuries to come. Crete, Euboea, and countless smaller islands fell under Venetian control, along with a quarter of Constantinople itself and the right to name the city's patriarch. The old dream of a reunited Christian empire was replaced by the reality of Venetian commercial hegemony. Meanwhile, the surviving members of the Byzantine nobility fled to the empire's remaining territories, establishing 3 separate successor states that each claimed to be the legitimate continuation of the Roman Empire. In Nicaea, John Vatatzes founded what would become the most successful of these successor states, while in Trebizond, the Grand Komnenos family established an empire that would outlast Byzantium itself. In Epirus, the despotate of Epirus controlled much of western Greece and Albania, completing the fragmentation of what had once been a unified empire. The sack of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout the Eastern Christian world. In Kiev and Moscow, in Bulgaria and Serbia, Orthodox Christians were horrified by the news that the great city had fallen not to Muslim infidels, but to fellow Christians who claimed to be serving God's will. The schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, which had been largely theological before 1204, now became a matter of life and death, poisoned by memories of betrayal and sacrilege that would endure for centuries. Pope Innocent III, when he learned of what had been done in Christ's name, was appalled. He had called for a crusade to liberate the Holy Land, not to destroy the greatest Christian city in the world. "You were supposed to recover the Holy Land," he wrote to the Crusaders, "but instead you have spilled Christian blood, despised the cross, and entered the sanctuary of God to rob, destroying and plundering." But his condemnation came too late to undo the damage that had been done. The Latin Empire of Constantinople would last for 57 years, a brief and troubled existence marked by constant warfare with the Byzantine successor states and the gradual loss of territory to enemies on all sides. Its emperors, dependent on Western subsidies and mercenary armies, never commanded the loyalty of their Greek subjects, who saw them as foreign usurpers rather than legitimate rulers. The great city itself, stripped of its treasures and cut off from its traditional trade routes, became a shadow of its former self, its population declining and its monuments crumbling from neglect. Yet even in the darkest hour of its history, the Byzantine spirit endured. In the churches of Nicaea and Trebizond, in the monasteries of Mount Athos and the Meteora, Orthodox Christians kept alive the traditions that had sustained the empire for more than 8 centuries. They preserved the liturgy, copied manuscripts, and maintained the hope that one day the great city would be restored to its rightful rulers. That hope would prove to be more than wishful thinking. In 1261, the armies of the Empire of Nicaea would recapture Constantinople, beginning the final chapter in the long story of Byzantine civilization. The summer morning of July 25, 1261, broke clear and bright over the Bosporus, its waters reflecting the golden light that had blessed Constantinople for nearly 1,000 years. In the harbour, fishing boats bobbed gently at anchor, while seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries mingling with the sound of church bells that had begun to ring throughout the city. But these were not the ordinary bells of morning prayer. They were the triumphant peals of liberation, announcing that after 57 years of Latin occupation, Constantinople had returned to Greek hands. The restoration had come almost as quietly as the morning dawn. General Alexios Strategopoulos, leading a small force of barely 800 men, had discovered that the city's Latin garrison had sailed away to attack the Byzantine island of Daphnusia, leaving Constantinople defended by only a handful of guards. Working through the night, Strategopoulos and his men had scaled the walls, opened the gates, and taken control of the city without significant bloodshed. When the sun rose, the double-headed eagle of Byzantium flew once again from the walls of the great palace, and the bells of every church in the city proclaimed the miracle that few had dared to hope for. Michael VIII, Palaiologos, Emperor of Nicaea and now reclaimer of Constantinople, entered his ancestral capital 15 days later in a procession that deliberately echoed the triumphs of ancient Rome. Dressed in purple silk and crowned with the diadem that had adorned the heads of Constantine and Justinian, he walked barefoot through the Golden Gate, following the miraculous icon of the Virgin Hodegetria that had protected the city through so many previous crises. Behind him marched the veterans of Nicaea, their armor gleaming in the August sun, while crowds lined the streets to witness the restoration of an empire that many had thought lost forever. The Hagia Sophia, scarred by decades of Latin occupation and Catholic ritual, was solemnly reconsecrated according to Orthodox tradition. The great church had suffered terribly during the years of exile. Its silver iconostasis had been melted down, its precious vessels sold to finance the Latin Empire's wars, its very soul seemingly extracted by foreign priests who celebrated the Mass in Latin rather than Greek. Now, as Patriarch Arsenios led the ceremony of restoration, the ancient building seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief, its golden dome once again reflecting the light of Orthodox Christianity. Yet the restored empire was a far cry from the mighty state that had fallen to the Crusaders in 1204. The territories recovered by Michael VIII comprised little more than Constantinople itself, parts of northwestern Anatolia, and scattered holdings in the Balkans and the Aegean Islands. The great themes that had once formed the backbone of Byzantine power, the rich agricultural lands of central Anatolia, the prosperous cities of Syria and Palestine, the Italian territories that had provided both wealth and strategic depth, were gone forever, divided among Turkish emirates, Latin principalities, and Italian maritime republics that had no intention of returning them. The empire's finances were in ruins. The Latin emperors had sold or mortgaged virtually every source of revenue to finance their desperate attempts to maintain power, while the Venetians had secured commercial privileges that gave them effective control over what remained of Byzantine trade. The treasury that had once overflowed with gold from across the known world was now so empty that emperors had to melt down palace decorations to mint the coins needed for basic government operations. Even more troubling was the empire's military situation. The theme system that had provided reliable soldiers for centuries had collapsed during the Latin occupation, its farmer soldiers scattered or reduced to serfdom. The professional regiments that had been the pride of earlier centuries were gone, replaced by expensive mercenary companies whose loyalty lasted only as long as their pay. The empire that had once fielded armies of 50,000 men could now barely manage a few thousand, and these were often foreigners, Italian condottieri, Turkish ghazis, Catalan almugavars, who fought for gold rather than for the Orthodox faith or the glory of Rome. Michael VIII understood these limitations better than most, and he devoted much of his reign to a sophisticated diplomatic strategy designed to compensate for military weakness. He negotiated with the Pope, offering to reunite the Eastern and Western churches in exchange for protection against the various enemies that surrounded his diminished realm. He made alliances with the Genoese against the Venetians, with the Bulgarians against the Serbs, with the Mamluks against the remaining Crusader states, always seeking to maintain a balance of power that would prevent any single enemy from becoming too dangerous. The emperor's diplomatic masterpiece was the Union of Lyons in 1274, where he formally accepted papal supremacy and agreed to the reunification of the churches. The agreement was deeply unpopular among his subjects, who saw it as a betrayal of Orthodox tradition, but it achieved its primary purpose. Pope Gregory VI abandoned his support for attempts to restore the Latin Empire and instead recognized Michael as the legitimate ruler of Constantinople. The threat of a new crusade against the restored Byzantine Empire was lifted, at least temporarily. Yet the union proved to be a hollow victory. The Orthodox clergy and people never accepted the submission to Rome, and Michael was forced to use increasingly harsh measures to enforce compliance with the papal agreement. Churches were closed, priests were exiled, and even the emperor's own sister was imprisoned for refusing to acknowledge papal authority. The empire that had been restored in joy and hope was now torn apart by religious conflict that weakened it far more than any external enemy could have done. Michael's son and successor, Andronikos II, repudiated the Union of Lyons shortly after coming to the throne in 1282, restoring Orthodox independence, but also eliminating the diplomatic protection that the agreement had provided. Almost immediately, new enemies began to press upon the empire's borders. In the west, Charles of Anjou revived the Latin claim to Constantinople, assembling a formidable army and fleet for what he called the restoration of the true empire. In the east, Turkish emirates pressed ever closer to the remaining Byzantine territories in Anatolia, their warriors eager for the plunder and glory that conquest would bring. The Sicilian Vespers of 1282 saved Byzantium from the Angevin threat, as a popular uprising in Sicily destroyed Charles's power and forced him to abandon his eastern ambitions. But the Turkish threat proved more persistent and ultimately more fatal. Led by charismatic commanders like Osman and his son Orhan, the Ottoman Beylik began to expand from its base in northwestern Anatolia, taking Byzantine cities one by one through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic skill. The empire's response to the Turkish advance was hampered by internal divisions that grew worse with each passing decade. The great aristocratic families, the Palaiologoi, Cantacuzenoi, and Dukas clans, fought bitter civil wars for control of the throne, each conflict weakening the empire's ability to resist external enemies. The devastating civil war between John V Palaiologos and John VI Cantacuzenos in the 1340s was particularly destructive, as both sides hired foreign mercenaries and made territorial concessions to secure military support. The most tragic aspect of these civil wars was that they accelerated the very process they were supposed to prevent. In his desperation to defeat John V, John VI invited Ottoman forces to cross into Europe, offering them the fortress of Gallipoli in exchange for military assistance. The Ottomans accepted the offer and then refused to leave, establishing their first permanent foothold in Europe and beginning the conquest that would eventually engulf the entire Balkan Peninsula. Yet even as the empire's territorial losses mounted, its cultural and intellectual life experienced a remarkable renaissance. The Palaiologos period saw a flowering of art, literature, and scholarship that rivaled the greatest achievements of earlier centuries. Scholars like Gemistos Plethon and Bessarion rediscovered the works of Plato and other ancient philosophers, while artists created masterpieces of late Byzantine art that combined traditional Orthodox themes with innovative techniques borrowed from Italian Renaissance masters. The monasteries of Mount Athos became centers of mystical theology, where monks developed the hesychast movement that emphasized direct, personal experience of the divine light. The theological works of Gregory Palamas and other hesychast masters influenced Orthodox spirituality for centuries to come, while their political activism helped preserve Orthodox independence in the face of repeated attempts at forced union with Rome. In Constantinople itself, the city experienced a final burst of prosperity during this early 14th century. The population, which had declined drastically during the Latin occupation, began to recover as refugees returned from Nicaea and other Byzantine successor states. New churches were built and old ones restored, their walls decorated with mosaics and frescoes that demonstrated the continued vitality of Byzantine artistic traditions. The University of Constantinople was revived, attracting scholars from across the Orthodox world and even from Western Europe, where interest in Greek learning was beginning to flourish. The empire's scholarly achievements during this period would have consequences far beyond its borders. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans, many of its scholars fled to the west, carrying with them manuscripts and knowledge that would fuel the Renaissance humanist movement. the restoration of Greek learning in Western Europe, which contributed so much to the cultural transformation of the late medieval and early modern periods, was in large part a gift from the scholars of this final Byzantine Renaissance. Yet none of these cultural achievements could disguise the empire's fundamental weakness. By 1400, Byzantine territory had shrunk to little more than Constantinople itself, the island of Lemnos, and the despotate of the Morea in southern Greece. The city that had once ruled half the Mediterranean world was now surrounded by Ottoman territory, connected to its remaining provinces only by the narrow sea lanes that Ottoman naval power could close at will. The emperors of this period were tragic figures, highly educated and cultured men who understood perfectly well the hopelessness of their situation, yet continued to struggle against impossible odds. They travelled to Western Europe seeking aid that never came, negotiated with the Pope about church union that their subjects would never accept, and watched helplessly as their empire continued to shrink year by year. They were the last guardians of a civilization that had illuminated the world for more than 1,000 years, and they performed their duty with a dignity that commanded respect even from their enemies. As the 15th century progressed, it became clear that the end was approaching. The Ottoman Empire under Murad II and later Mehmed II had become the dominant power in southeastern Europe and Western Asia, commanding resources that dwarfed anything the Byzantines could hope to match. Yet still, the empire endured, a flickering light in the gathering darkness, sustained by the stubborn courage of its people and the ancient belief that Constantinople was under the special protection of the Virgin Mary. The final test of that faith was yet to come. The winter of 1452 passed with unusual severity over Constantinople, the waters of the Golden Horn freezing solid for the first time in living memory. The citizens took it as an omen, though whether for good or ill, none could say. In the narrow streets of the old city, where Byzantine merchants had once grown rich on the silk trade with China, refugees from the Ottoman conquests in Anatolia huddled around braziers, their faces gaunt with hunger and their eyes hollow with the certainty that worse times lay ahead. Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, the last of his ancient line, spent the dark months of winter in prayer and preparation. He was 48 years old, a man who had never expected to rule. The throne had come to him only after the deaths of his older brothers, and he had accepted it with the resignation of one who understood that he was destined to preside over the final chapter of a story that had begun with Constantine the Great more than 11 centuries before. In the cold hours before dawn, he could often be found kneeling before the icon of the Virgin Hodegetria in the palace chapel, his lips moving in silent prayer for the salvation of his city and his people. Across the narrow waters of the Bosporus, in the hills of Anatolia, Sultan Mehmed II was making very different preparations. At 21, he was younger than the empire he planned to destroy, but he possessed an intelligence and ruthlessness that had already marked him as one of the most formidable rulers of his age. The Byzantines called him the Young Wolf, and they were not far wrong. He had the predator's instinct for weakness, the hunter's patience in stalking his prey, and the killer's determination to finish what he had begun. Mehmed had been dreaming of Constantinople since childhood. His tutors had filled his mind with stories of the great city's wealth and beauty, while his military advisors had pointed out its strategic importance as the key to controlling the passage between Europe and Asia. Previous Ottoman sultans had been content to leave the Byzantine Empire as a harmless rump state, more useful as a buffer than a conquest, but Mehmed saw things differently. As long as Constantinople remained in Christian hands, it would serve as a symbol of resistance to Ottoman expansion, a rallying point for future crusades, and a potential weakness in the Ottoman Empire's defenses. The young sultan's preparations were methodical and terrifying in their scope. Throughout the winter of 1452 to 1453, Ottoman engineers worked to construct the fortress of Rumeli Hisar on the European shore of the Bosporus, directly across from the Asian fortress of Anadolu Hisar that his great-grandfather had built 50 years before. Together, these two fortresses could completely control shipping through the Bosporus, cutting Constantinople off from any aid that might come from the Black Sea or the empire's remaining territories in the Morea. The construction of Rumeli Hisar was a deliberate act of war, a violation of the agreements that had allowed the Byzantine Empire to survive as an Ottoman vassal state. When Constantine sent ambassadors to protest the fortress's construction, Mehmed had them executed, a clear signal that the time for diplomacy had passed. The walls of Rumeli Hisar rose with supernatural speed, its towers and battlements taking shape as winter gave way to spring, while Ottoman cannons were positioned to sink any vessel that attempted to run the straits without permission. In the workshops of Adrianople, the Ottoman capital, Hungarian engineer Orban was perfecting the weapon that would make the ancient walls of Constantinople as obsolete as bronze spears in an age of steel. His great cannon, dubbed Basilica by the Greeks who would soon face it, was a monster of bronze and iron, nearly 30 feet long, capable of hurling stone balls weighing more than half a ton. No fortification in the world had been built to withstand such weapons, and the walls of Constantinople, for all their legendary strength, were about to face their ultimate test. As spring arrived in 1453, the diplomatic situation grew increasingly desperate for the Byzantines. Constantine sent envoys to every Christian court in Europe, begging for aid against the Ottoman threat. The responses were uniformly disappointing. The Italian city-states were too busy with their own wars to spare soldiers for Constantinople. The Hungarian kingdom was exhausted from its own struggles with the Ottomans, and the Western European powers were either too distant or too suspicious of Greek orthodoxy to commit significant resources to the city's defense. The Pope offered aid, but only in exchange for the formal reunion of the Eastern and Western churches, a price that Constantine was reluctantly prepared to pay, though he knew it would divide his own people at the moment when unity was most essential. On December 12, 1452, a ceremony was held in the Hagia Sophia to proclaim the union of the churches, with Cardinal Isidore of Kiev celebrating Mass according to the Latin rite, while the emperor and a handful of courtiers looked on. The great church was almost empty. Most of the city's population had stayed away in protest, and even many of the clergy refused to participate in what they saw as a betrayal of their faith. The union ceremony provided little practical benefit. A few hundred Genoese soldiers arrived under the command of Giovanni Giustiniani, a professional soldier who became the most effective defender of the land wall, but no major Western power sent significant aid. The Byzantine Empire would face its final siege essentially alone, defended by perhaps 7,000 men, a mixture of Byzantine soldiers, Italian mercenaries, and civilian volunteers, against an Ottoman army that may have numbered 150,000. The siege began on April 6, 1453, when Ottoman forces completed their encirclement of the city. Mehmed's army was a cosmopolitan force that reflected the diversity of his empire: Turkish infantry and cavalry, Serbian and Bulgarian auxiliaries, Hungarian artillerymen, and engineers from across Europe who had come to serve the Sultan for gold or glory. The Ottoman fleet, though smaller than the army, was large enough to complete the blockade by controlling the waters of the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara. For 7 weeks, the greatest siege in medieval history unfolded before the walls of Constantinople. The Ottoman artillery, including Orban's great cannon, pounded the ancient fortifications day and night, creating breaches that the defenders struggled desperately to repair. The Byzantines fought with the courage of desperation, knowing that defeat meant not just the end of their empire, but the destruction of their civilization. They rolled barrels of Greek fire onto the attackers, hurled stones and arrows from the walls, and launched desperate sorties to destroy the siege engines that crept ever closer to their defenses. The city's population, swollen by refugees from across the dying empire, endured the siege with a mixture of terror and stubborn defiance. In the churches, priests led constant prayers for deliverance, while in the streets, citizens worked frantically to reinforce the walls with whatever materials they could find: stones from ruined buildings, timber from dismantled houses, even precious marble from ancient monuments. Children as young as 10 carried water and food to the defenders, while women melted down their jewelry to provide metal for weapons and repairs. Emperor Constantine himself became the soul of the resistance. Each day found him on the walls, sharing the dangers of his soldiers, encouraging the weary, and demonstrating by his presence that the last emperor of Byzantium would never surrender his city without a fight. He had put aside the purple robes of imperial majesty for the practical armor of a soldier, and those who saw him during those final weeks remembered not a defeated monarch, but a warrior king worthy of the heroes of ancient Troy. The most dramatic moment of the siege came when Mehmed attempted to break the Byzantine control of the Golden Horn by transporting his ships overland. Under cover of darkness, Ottoman engineers greased wooden rollers and hauled more than 70 vessels across the hills of Pera, launching them into the waters behind the great chain that had protected the harbour for so many centuries. The sight of Ottoman ships sailing in waters that had been secure since the city's founding was a psychological blow that struck the defenders like a physical wound. Yet still, the city held. The walls, though battered and breached in several places, continued to stand, while the defenders' spirits were sustained by ancient prophecies that promised Constantinople would never fall to unbelievers. Some pointed to the lunar eclipse that occurred during the siege as a sign of divine favor, while others took comfort in the legend that the city would endure until the end of time, protected by the Virgin Mary herself. As May drew toward its close, both sides were approaching exhaustion. The Ottoman army, despite its overwhelming numerical superiority, had suffered heavy casualties in its repeated assaults, while Mehmed himself was under pressure from his advisers to abandon the siege before the arrival of a relief army or the approach of winter made continued operations impossible. The defenders, meanwhile, were running short of gunpowder, food, and most critically, men. Every day brought new casualties that could not be replaced. The final assault was scheduled for May 29th, the anniversary of the city's founding. Mehmed ordered his cannons to fire continuously through the night, their thunder echoing across the waters of the Bosporus like the voice of approaching doom. In the Hagia Sophia, Constantine attended what he must have known would be his last divine liturgy, receiving communion with a solemnity that moved even his enemies to respect. As dawn approached, he made his final speech to the defenders, reminding them that they fought not just for their city, but for their faith, their families, and the memory of 1,000 years of glory. The attack began before sunrise, with waves of Ottoman irregulars hurling themselves against the walls in a desperate attempt to exhaust the defenders' ammunition and energy. These Bashi bazouks, as they were called, were mostly volunteers seeking plunder rather than professional soldiers, but their numbers were so vast that they nearly overwhelmed the walls through sheer mass. For 2 hours, the battle raged with unprecedented fury, the air thick with smoke from cannons and Greek fire, the ground slick with blood from both armies. The critical breakthrough came at the Kerkeporta, a small gate in the land wall that had somehow been left unlocked during the night. A group of Ottoman soldiers discovered the opening and poured through, taking the defenders in the rear and creating panic along the wall. At almost the same moment, the Janissaries, the elite troops of the Ottoman army, launched their final assault on the main breach where Giovanni Justiniani had fallen wounded, and his men were wavering. Emperor Constantine, seeing that the end had come, stripped off his imperial regalia so that his body could not be identified and dishonored by the victors. With a handful of loyal companions, he charged into the thickest fighting at the breach, sword in hand, choosing to die as a soldier rather than live as a captive. His body was never found with certainty among the thousands of corpses that littered the walls, though Ottoman soldiers later claimed to have discovered a headless body wearing purple boots that might have been the last emperor's remains. By noon on May 29th, 1453, the city of Constantine was in Ottoman hands. Mehmed the Conqueror entered through the same Golden Gate where Michael VIII Palaiologos had processed in triumph 2 centuries before, riding slowly through streets littered with the debris of conquest. His first destination was the Hagia Sophia, where he dismounted and knelt in prayer, symbolically transforming the great church into a mosque and marking the definitive end of the Byzantine Empire. The sack that followed was less destructive than the one carried out by the Crusaders in 1204, but it was thorough enough. The Sultan had promised his soldiers 3 days of plunder, and they made the most of their opportunity, carrying away whatever treasures had survived the previous sacks and sieges. Many of the city's inhabitants were enslaved, though Mehmed was careful to preserve the skilled craftsmen and merchants who could contribute to his empire's prosperity. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world. Church bells tolled in mourning from Moscow to London, while scholars who had fled the dying empire carried with them the manuscripts and knowledge that would help fuel the Renaissance in Western Europe. The news reached some corners of Europe only months later, carried by merchants and diplomats who could scarcely believe that the city which had withstood so many sieges had finally fallen. Yet in the conquered city itself, life gradually returned to a new kind of normalcy. Mehmed, who styled himself as the heir to both the Ottoman and Roman imperial traditions, worked to restore Constantinople's prosperity and population. He invited Greek merchants to return, rebuilt the damaged neighborhoods, and even appointed a new Orthodox patriarch to minister to the city's remaining Christian population. The great city would rise again, not as the capital of a Christian empire, but as the seat of a Muslim sultanate that would dominate southeastern Europe and Western Asia for centuries to come. As the sun set over the Bosporus on that historic day in 1453, it marked the end of more than just an empire. It was the conclusion of a story that had begun when Constantine the Great first gazed across these same waters and envisioned a new Rome for a new age. The Byzantine Empire, the last living remnant of the ancient Roman world, had finally succumbed after more than 1,000 years of glory and struggle, triumph and tragedy. In the gathering twilight, the great dome of the Hagia Sophia still caught the last light of day, its golden surface reflecting the fires that burned throughout the conquered city. Tomorrow, the call to prayer would echo from its minarets for the first time. But tonight, in the silence between the old world and the new, it remained what it had always been, a testament to human faith, a monument to artistic genius, and a bridge between earth and heaven that would endure long after the empires that built it had passed into memory. The story of Byzantium was finished, but its legacy would live on in the art and architecture, the laws and literature, the faith and philosophy that had flourished within its borders. From the monasteries of Mount Athos to the universities of Western Europe, from the churches of Russia to the libraries of Italy, the influence of the Byzantine Empire would continue to shape human civilization long after the last emperor had fallen and the double-headed eagle had been replaced by the crescent moon. The empire was dead, but its spirit, the spirit of a people who had preserved the light of learning through the darkest ages and defended the gates of Europe against overwhelming odds, would prove as immortal as the city they had loved and lost. In the end, perhaps that was enough. For more than 11 centuries, Constantinople had stood as a beacon of faith and culture, a bridge between East and West, ancient and modern, the divine and the human. It had preserved the wisdom of the classical world through the chaos of the Dark Ages, created works of art and architecture that still inspire wonder after half a millennium, and demonstrated that human civilization could endure even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The last Byzantine emperor had fallen defending his city's walls, but the ideals for which he died, the belief in the dignity of human learning, the conviction that beauty and truth were worth defending, the faith that even in darkness there could be light, these would outlive all the empires that rose and fell around them. In the end, that was the true victory of Byzantium, not the conquest of territory or the accumulation of wealth, but the preservation of what was best in human culture for future generations to discover, to cherish, and to pass on in their turn. The Byzantine Empire was no more, but its story would be told as long as human beings gathered to remember the past and dream of the future. In the whisper of wind through the dome of the Hagia Sophia, in the glimmer of gold in an ancient mosaic, in the sound of Byzantine chant echoing through Orthodox churches around the world, the empire lived on, not as a political entity, but as something far more precious and enduring, a testament to the indomitable human spirit and the eternal power of hope over despair, of light over darkness, of memory over oblivion.